September 1942, Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, Canadian Atlantic coast. The North Atlantic wind carried more than salt spray and the scent of pine forests. It carried the weight of a continental struggle. By this point in the war, the German Luftwaffe had proven itself a lethal instrument of dominance. Their bombers ranged across the skies of Europe and North Africa. Their fighters intercepted Allied formations with devastating precision. Their reconnaissance aircraft operated with near impunity, photographing British shipyards, American industrial complexes, and critical convoy routes. The technological gap seemed insurmountable. The Germans possessed superior aircraft design, hardened radar systems, and a consolidated military-industrial complex that had been perfecting air warfare for 3 years, without interruption. Canada, by contrast, was an emerging technological power, still finding its footing in a global conflict that demanded innovation faster than tradition could afford. Darkness fell early along the Canadian coast that September. The summer had been short, brutal, and filled with a specific kind of anxiety. German U-boats prowled the St. Lawrence River. Merchant ships were being sunk within sight of land. Coastal towns organized blackout protocols. Radio operators maintained constant vigilance for distress signals. The war was no longer a distant European affair. It had arrived at Canada's doorstep in the form of torpedo tracks and burning hulls. It was in this context that the Canadian government authorized a series of experimental radar stations along the Atlantic seaboard. These were not to be the conventional installations that British and American engineers had constructed. Conventional radar towers, towering metal structures with geometric precision, were expensive, conspicuous, and vulnerable to both bombing and electronic countermeasures. They represented an architectural statement. We are here. We are watching. The Germans had learned to anticipate these towers. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft photographed them systematically. Engineers in Berlin cataloged their locations, their operating frequencies, their probable detection ranges. Strategic bombing campaigns were planned around them. The metal towers were beacons, not just of radar coverage, but of targets waiting to be destroyed. It was here that a small group of Canadian military engineers proposed something radical: build the radar towers from wood. To Berlin's military planners, the notion seemed almost comical. Wooden radar towers? The very concept violated the principles of modern military engineering. Metal frameworks provided structural integrity. Metal antenna arrays conducted signals with precision. Metal was the material of war: steel for ships and aircraft, copper for electrical systems, aluminum for fuselages. A military installation constructed from timber seemed like something from an earlier century, a relic of an industrial age that had been superseded by the technologies that now dominated the battlefield. Yet Canada's decision was not born from technological inferiority. It emerged from lateral thinking, from the recognition that the most effective defense against enemy surveillance was invisibility, not fortification. Along the cliffs of Newfoundland and the maritime provinces, small teams of construction workers and military personnel began erecting these structures. The landscape itself dictated the approach. The Canadian Shield had always provided timber in abundance. Dense forests surrounded the proposed radar sites. The wood would blend into the natural environment. To aerial reconnaissance, a wooden tower among trees was nearly indistinguishable from the forest itself. To radar-seeking aircraft, wood presented no detectable signature, no metallic reflection, no electromagnetic echo. The towers rose silently through the autumn of 1942. They were functional, austere constructions, built with military precision, but camouflaged with deliberate artlessness. Canvas and paint provided minimal concealment. Strategic positioning among existing tree lines offered natural cover. The antenna arrays, though composed of some metal elements, were minimal and dispersed rather than concentrated into the towering metal frameworks that German reconnaissance pilots had learned to identify and target. The operation was classified under the designation Radar Set Type 271, a designation that meant nothing to anyone outside the narrow circle of British and Canadian military intelligence, signals officers, and government administrators who knew of its existence. This was the paradox at the heart of the Canadian initiative. In an age of technological escalation, the most advanced defensive system was one that didn't look advanced at all. It didn't announce itself. It didn't proclaim its military purpose. It simply existed quietly, in the Canadian wilderness. A wooden lattice structure that housed electrical equipment of genuine sophistication, staffed by trained operators who maintained continuous watch over the approaches to North America. The operators who staffed these installations understood their role in the larger strategic picture, though the full scope was never disclosed to them. They monitored the skies above the Atlantic with methodical discipline. Every blip on the screen, every anomalous signal, was logged and reported through encrypted channels to naval and Air Force commands. They were part of an emerging revolution in warfare, one where victory and defeat were being determined not by individual combats between pilots or the maneuvering of ships, but by the ability to detect, warn, and redirect defensive forces before enemy weapons could strike. The Canadian wooden radar towers represented something more subtle than a mere technological innovation. They represented a strategic philosophy that in modern warfare, concealment could be more powerful than firepower, and that the most dangerous weapon was often the one your enemy didn't know existed until it was too late to do anything about it. This is the story of how a nation that was often dismissed as a minor industrial power proved that innovation in wartime rarely comes from the largest armies or the most prominent industrial centers. Sometimes it emerges from smaller nations, from engineers and military strategists willing to think unconventionally about the nature of modern conflict, and from the recognition that the enemy's greatest weakness was their own confidence in the superiority of their established methods. By late 1942, Berlin had no idea that a wooden network was forming across Canadian territory, and by the time German intelligence recognized what was happening, it would already be too late. Late October 1942, Operational Command Center, Royal Canadian Air Force, Halifax. The first confirmed detection came as a routine signal. Nothing remarkable. A Luftwaffe FW-200 Condor, a long-range reconnaissance aircraft, approaching the Newfoundland coast from the northeast. The wooden radar tower at Cape Race had detected it at 187 kilometers distance. The signal was clean, unambiguous, and immediate. Within minutes, the data had been encrypted and transmitted to Air Defense Headquarters. Within 10 more minutes, a Canadian fighter squadron was vectored toward intercept coordinates. The Condor never reached its reconnaissance objective. This single encounter was not exceptional. What made it significant was what happened next. The documentation, the analysis, the systematic recording of an event that revealed something previously invisible to Canadian military planners. For months, reconnaissance sorties had been escaping detection. German reconnaissance aircraft would arrive over Canadian airspace, photograph critical installations, shipyards in Halifax, aircraft assembly plants in Windsor, convoy assembly points at St. John's, and return to occupied territory without interference. The Luftwaffe possessed superior speed and altitude capability. They could operate above the effective range of most Canadian fighter patrols. They could choose their approach vectors and timing with near total freedom. This represented a critical intelligence advantage for Berlin: knowledge of North American industrial capacity, knowledge of convoy routes, knowledge of defensive dispositions. The wooden radar towers changed this equation entirely. The intelligence reports that followed the Cape Race intercept were initially classified, most secret, restricted distribution. Only senior commanders within Canadian Air Force operations and British RAF liaison officers possessed access to the full details. The reports contained technical specifications that would have seemed almost mundane to anyone without military training. Radar frequency designations, detection range parameters, pulse repetition rates, antenna bearing accuracy. What made these specifications revolutionary was their practical implications. The radar set Type 271, as the Canadian system was designated, operated on a centimetric wavelength, specifically around 10 centimeters in the microwave spectrum. This frequency offered three distinct advantages. First, the shorter wavelength provided superior angular resolution, allowing operators to distinguish between multiple aircraft in close formation, or to identify specific aircraft types based on radar cross-section signatures. Second, centimetric radar was far more difficult for enemy electronic warfare specialists to jam or deceive with conventional countermeasures. The Germans possessed extensive experience with meter-wave radar systems. They had developed effective jamming techniques against British chain home installations that operated in the 10-meter frequency band. Centimetric systems required entirely different approaches to jamming, and German research into these countermeasures was significantly behind Allied development. Third, and most critically for the Canadian initiative, centimetric radar could be operated from smaller, less conspicuous installations. The operational specifications were striking: a single wooden tower, approximately 30 meters in height, constructed from laminated timber frames and cross-braced supports, could detect large aircraft at ranges exceeding 150 kilometers under optimal atmospheric conditions. Medium bombers could be detected reliably at 130-140 kilometers. Fighter-sized aircraft presented more variable returns depending on aspect angle and altitude, but detections at 70-90 kilometers were routine. The installation required a crew of 12 to 15 operators and maintenance personnel, working in rotating 8-hour shifts to maintain continuous coverage. The electrical systems were sophisticated. Vacuum tube transmitters, operating at approximately 50 kilowatts of pulsed radio frequency power, generated signals that were broadcast through parabolic antenna arrays. The return echoes were detected by sensitive receiver circuits and displayed on cathode ray tube screens, the same display technology used in oscilloscopes. Trained operators, working with practiced precision, could distinguish genuine aircraft returns from atmospheric clutter within seconds. What made the system operationally decisive was not any single technological breakthrough. British and American radar researchers had achieved comparable performance in stationary coastal installations. What made the Canadian wooden radar towers strategically significant was their distribution, their invisibility, and their integration into a unified air defense network. By December 1942, 5 operational wooden radar towers had been constructed and activated along the Newfoundland and Nova Scotia coastlines. By March 1943, the number had increased to 12. By the end of 1943, Canadian and British military planners had activated a chain of 23 such installations, extending from the Labrador coast south to Maine. The coverage was not continuous. Gaps existed along certain approaches where geography and logistics prevented installation, but the gaps were minimal, and the network effect was immediate and measurable. Luftwaffe reconnaissance sorties, which had previously operated with relative impunity, began experiencing intercepts at rates that exceeded historical patterns by a factor of 3, then 5, then 10. German pilots reported increased frequency of fighter encounters. Their aircraft were being intercepted before they reached photography objectives. The timing of these intercepts was too consistent, too predictable to be attributable to chance or routine patrol patterns. Intelligence officers in Berlin filed reports noting an apparent enhancement in Canadian air defense capabilities. Though the exact nature of the enhancement remained classified and elusive, the operational logs were meticulously maintained. Every detection was recorded with timestamp, altitude estimate, course heading, aircraft classification, and intercept result. The data accumulated into a comprehensive record of Luftwaffe activity over the North Atlantic. By early 1944, Canadian Air Force intelligence officers could reconstruct the complete pattern of German reconnaissance operations. Mission frequencies, aircraft types deployed, preferred approach vectors, probable objectives. This intelligence transformed the defensive calculus. Canadian fighter squadrons began conducting offensive patrols along projected approach routes, not in response to detected aircraft but in anticipation of them. The tactical advantage had shifted. German aircraft were no longer arriving as strategic surprises. They were arriving into prepared ambushes. The wooden towers themselves remained unknown to German intelligence. The towers were photographed, analyzed, and dismissed as logging operations or utility structures. Their true function remained concealed until long after the war's conclusion. This was the precise objective: invisible defense operating in the shadows of Canadian forests, detecting threats before they materialized, and ensuring that the Luftwaffe's reconnaissance advantage, once nearly absolute, had been systematically neutralized. The first formal intelligence report arrived on the desk of Generaloberst Erhard Milch in late April 1943. The document was marked Auswertungsstelle für Luftkrieg, Evaluation Office for Air War, the German Air Ministry's primary analytical division. The report was brief, methodical, and deeply troubling. Between January and March 1943, German long-range reconnaissance aircraft operating over the North Atlantic had experienced a measurable increase in interception rates. The data was unambiguous. In 1942, approximately 73% of Luftwaffe FW-200 Condor and Bf-110 reconnaissance missions successfully completed their objectives and returned to bases in occupied France or Norway. In early 1943, that figure had declined to 51%. By spring 1943, it had dropped further to 38%. Aircraft losses had increased by a factor of 2.8 over comparable periods in the previous year. More significantly, the pattern of interception suggested systematic detection rather than random chance or improved Canadian fighter tactics. The Luftwaffe's strategic reconnaissance program over North America had been conceived as a low-risk intelligence operation. German aircraft, operating at altitudes between 8,000 and 10,000 meters, possessed performance advantages that made interception extremely difficult for Allied fighters. Canadian fighter squadrons, equipped primarily with Hawker Hurricanes and early Supermarine Spitfire Mark I's, faced significant performance limitations at extreme altitude. The Condor, though slower in level flight than modern fighters, could climb to operational altitude and maintain station above effective fighter interception envelopes. This advantage had proven decisive throughout 1942. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed Canadian shipyards, aircraft manufacturing facilities, convoy assembly points, and industrial complexes with minimal losses. The photographs were analyzed in Berlin, providing German naval planners with current intelligence on North American industrial capacity and shipping movements. This intelligence informed strategic decisions regarding U-boat deployment, bombing campaign priorities, and long-range reconnaissance mission planning. By mid-1943, that intelligence advantage was evaporating. The analysis conducted by the Luftwaffe's Evaluation Office produced several hypotheses. The first was technical. Canadian fighter performance had been significantly enhanced. Aircraft were equipped with new engines, superchargers, or oxygen systems that permitted higher operational ceilings and improved climb rates. The hypothesis was assessed as possible, but improbable. No captured aircraft, prisoner interrogations, or agent reports had indicated such dramatic improvements in Canadian fighter capability. The second hypothesis was tactical. Canadian fighter squadrons had instituted new operational procedures, possibly involving coordinated ground-directed interceptions that concentrated fighter forces along likely reconnaissance approach vectors. This hypothesis was assessed as probable. The timing of interceptions, the concentration of fighter encounters along specific geographic corridors, and the increased coordination evident in intercept patterns all suggested ground direction and centralized control. But this raised an unanswerable question. How were Canadian air defense commanders predicting reconnaissance flight paths and timing with such accuracy? The third hypothesis was organizational. The Canadians had expanded their air defense fighter force with American assistance, providing higher squadron density and broader geographic coverage. This hypothesis was partially confirmed through agent reports and traffic analysis. Canadian fighter squadrons had indeed been expanded. American Lend-Lease aircraft were flowing into Canadian inventory, but this expansion was insufficient to explain the improvement in interception rates. Something else was operating at a deeper strategic level. By September 1943, intelligence officers in Berlin formally concluded that Canadian air defense capabilities had undergone qualitative enhancement of unknown nature. The exact mechanism remained unidentified. The possibility of new detection technology was considered but not emphasized. Such technology was considered speculative and theoretically advanced beyond current Allied capabilities. No one in Berlin suspected wooden radar towers. General Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, received briefing reports on the deteriorating reconnaissance aircraft loss rates. The implications for German strategic planning were severe. Reconnaissance aircraft provided the only systematic intelligence on North American industrial activity, convoy operations, and military dispositions. Without current intelligence, German strategic bombing campaign planning became speculative. U-boat operations in the North Atlantic operated with significantly reduced tactical effectiveness. Long-range bombing initiatives, including the Luftwaffe's periodic discussion of transatlantic bombing campaigns, became impossible to plan with any confidence. Galland's response was direct: conduct aggressive fighter sweeps to suppress Canadian interceptor operations and increase reconnaissance sortie frequency to overwhelm Canadian air defense capacity through numerical saturation. The strategy was logical within conventional military doctrine. It was also completely ineffective. In November and December 1943, the Luftwaffe launched 17 consecutive long-range reconnaissance missions over Canadian territory, dispatching 47 individual aircraft. The mission profile was aggressive: faster approach routes, higher altitudes, multiple simultaneous sorties to distribute Canadian interceptor response. The result was catastrophic for German air operations. 31 aircraft were shot down or damaged beyond operational recovery. Only 16 sorties successfully completed reconnaissance objectives. The loss rate had exceeded 66%. No defensive strategy could sustain such losses. The reconnaissance program was temporarily suspended. German intelligence assessed that Canadian air defense had achieved approximate parity with German capabilities in the North Atlantic theater. The assessment was incorrect. Canadian air defense had achieved superiority. But the nature of that superiority, a network of invisible detection systems integrated into a unified command structure, remained completely unknown to Berlin. What Berlin understood with painful clarity was the strategic consequence. Reconnaissance advantage in the North Atlantic had transitioned from German hands to Canadian-American hands. This represented a fundamental alteration in the strategic balance. The Germans could not respond through conventional military means. The Canadian coast was geographically remote, well defended, and climatically hostile to German offensive operations. U-boats could not attack stationary radar installations. The Luftwaffe lacked the range and capacity to conduct sustained bombing campaigns against Canadian territory. Strategic bombing resources were committed to defending German airspace against increasing American daylight bombing raids and RAF night bombing offensives. By early 1944, German strategic reconnaissance over North America had effectively ceased. The intelligence advantage that the Luftwaffe had maintained since 1940 had been systematically eliminated. The wooden towers, unknown and unsuspected, had accomplished what explicit military force could not achieve. They had blinded the enemy. The strategic impact rippled through German military planning for the remainder of the war. Uncertainty replaced knowledge. Strategic bombing campaigns were planned on assumption rather than intelligence. U-boat operations in the North Atlantic proceeded without current data on convoy positions and schedules. The advantage that had accrued to Germany through superior reconnaissance was transformed into strategic disadvantage, all from structures that looked like nothing at all. June 6, 1944. The wooden radar tower stood silent watch over the Canadian coastline, while history transformed across the Atlantic. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, depended on a single critical requirement: air superiority. The German Luftwaffe had to be prevented from photographing the invasion fleet before it reached the coast. German bombers had to be kept from attacking the transport formations and landing craft. German reconnaissance aircraft had to be denied current intelligence on the disposition and movements of Allied forces. The wooden radar towers, built in the forests of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, had prepared the ground for this moment. By June 1944, the network had expanded to 47 operational installations. The coverage extended from Labrador to New England, creating a continuous detection screen across the northern approaches to North America and the central North Atlantic. More critically, the integration of Canadian and American radar systems had created the first truly unified air defense network in the theater. Aircraft detected by Canadian wooden towers were instantaneously tracked by American radar installations. Fighters were vectored by integrated command centers. The technological asymmetry that had defined Atlantic air operations in 1942 had been completely inverted. On the morning of June 6th, not a single German reconnaissance aircraft successfully photographed the invasion fleet during the critical pre-landing phase. Not one. The intelligence blackout was absolute and systematic. German commanders in Normandy were operating in profound uncertainty. The Luftwaffe High Command knew an invasion was coming. They possessed that strategic intelligence through other channels, but they possessed no current tactical intelligence on force composition, landing times, objective beaches, or supporting operations. This intelligence void was catastrophic for German defensive operations. The wooden towers had achieved their ultimate strategic purpose. They had contributed, through systematic denial of reconnaissance capability, to the creation of tactical surprise at the moment of invasion. The Luftwaffe, which had once dominated Atlantic reconnaissance, was now completely blinded over the most critical operational theater, at the most critical operational moment. As the invasion proceeded through June and July 1944, the German strategic situation continued deteriorating. The Luftwaffe's reconnaissance arm, decimated by losses and uncertain of operational priorities, never recovered its pre-1943 capability. Aircraft that were dispatched on reconnaissance missions were increasingly intercepted before reaching objectives. The pattern had become normalized. German reconnaissance operations over Allied territory, were now characterized by high loss rates and low intelligence return. The advantage of time and intelligence, which Germany had possessed at the war's beginning, had been systematically eroded through technological innovation and strategic integration. The wooden radar towers never became public knowledge during the war. They were not mentioned in communiques. No press releases celebrated their operational success. They were classified most secret and remained so for decades after the war's conclusion. Military historians investigating the air defense of the Atlantic rarely encountered detailed information about them. The installations themselves, weathered by maritime storms and time, gradually deteriorated through the late 1940s and 1950s. Most were dismantled. Some were abandoned. A few, very few, remained in place into the 1960s, forgotten monuments to an operational achievement that had transformed the strategic balance of the Atlantic theater. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The wooden radar towers continued their watch over the Canadian coast. Their mission concluded, their purpose fulfilled, their existence still classified. The operators who had staffed them, many were returned to civilian life, carried the knowledge of their work in secrecy for decades. Official military histories written in the immediate post-war period made sparse reference to Canadian radar operations. The strategic significance of invisible detection was still not widely understood. The revolution in warfare that radar had initiated was only beginning to be comprehended. The German Luftwaffe, which had once seemed invulnerable in the Atlantic skies, had been systematically neutralized not through superior aircraft or conventional military force, but through superior information. The side that could see won. The side that could not see was defeated. It was not until the 1970s, 3 decades after the war's conclusion, that the full operational details of the Canadian radar program began to emerge in declassified documents. Military historians reconstructed the timeline. The development of the Type 271 centimetric radar systems, their integration into Canadian air defense, their systematic expansion, the progressive degradation of German reconnaissance capability, the ultimate blackout of Luftwaffe intelligence over the Atlantic approaches during the critical months of 1944. The contribution was substantial. Some military analysts assessed that the denial of German reconnaissance intelligence, combined with American radar integration and Canadian fighter operations, had contributed measurably to the success of Operation Overlord. Without that intelligence denial, German defensive planning in Normandy might have achieved different tactical results. The wooden towers had, through invisibility and precision, altered the course of military history. Today, very few of the original wooden radar towers remain. Most have succumbed to weather, decay, and deliberate removal. A single restored installation exists as a historical monument. Weathered timber structures standing in the Canadian wilderness, silent testimony to a technological achievement that transformed the nature of warfare. The story of these towers represents something larger than a single technological innovation. It represents the principle that strategic advantage in modern warfare often derives from asymmetric innovation rather than industrial scale. It represents the recognition that visibility and conspicuousness are vulnerabilities in the modern age, and that the most powerful defensive systems are often those that operate invisible to the enemy. The German engineers who mocked the Canadian concept of wooden radar towers never understood what they were mocking. They were defending an outdated assumption that military technology must be metallic, visible, and conventionally engineered. The Canadians had recognized a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare, that in the age of detection and counter-detection, the unseen fortress was stronger than the visible one. By the time Berlin recognized what was happening, the pattern was already established, the advantage had already shifted, and the war itself was already being determined by forces that operated beyond the reach of conventional German defensive doctrine. The wooden towers of the Canadian coast remain, in many respects, forgotten. They appear in few histories. They receive minimal attention in military academies. They are overshadowed by more conspicuous technological achievements. The code-breaking of Bletchley Park, the development of radar itself in Britain, the strategic bombing campaigns that dominated the air war over Europe. Yet their strategic significance was profound and measurable. They transformed the intelligence balance of the Atlantic theater, they contributed to the success of the invasion, and they demonstrated that innovation in wartime rarely comes from the largest or most visible sources. Sometimes it comes from a small nation, looking at a problem differently, building something that doesn't look like anything at all, and achieving results that changed the course of the war itself. Thank you for watching. If this forgotten story amazed you, subscribe to our channel for more untold histories of World War II innovation and the hidden operations that shaped the conflict. Which secret military operation do you think had the greatest impact on the war? Let us know in the comments below. And if you know the story of the wooden radar towers, share your knowledge with others. History deserves to remember the innovations that operate in silence.